Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we have Ranju Roy, who is going to be talking about his book, Embodying the Yoga Sutras. Can you hold up your beautiful book? The
Sure.
support.
Oh, this is the UK edition, but
Oh,
which is slightly different to the American edition.
okay. Well, for folks who are listening in the UK, it's going to look like this: Embodying the Yoga Sutra, support,
So
direction, and space. So welcome.
thank you.
Like what has driven you and Dave in writing this book and spending 30 years of your life to dive deeper and deeper into the Yoga Sutras? What has been the driving
We
question?
were introduced to this text called the Yoga Sutra. Now, everybody knows about the Kama Sutra, so the word sutra already is kind of like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
So, and so a sutra is just a form of writing. It's a very, very short aphoristic style of writing. So there are lots and lots of different texts called the something sutra, the Kama Sutra, the Nyaya Sutra, the Vedanta Sutra, and there was this text called the Yoga Sutra by this guy called Patanjali. So we were introduced to this. Paul, on that first 5 day retreat, we were introduced to this text and we had a look at some of there are 195 short verses in this text, the Yoga Sutra. And we basically looked at some of them, and we looked at some of them in their original language, in the Sanskrit. So Paul taught us these things, and it really, really fired us up. I mean, it fired me up with a lot of interest because, not so much at that time. At that time, not so much because it was answering reality. It wasn't that it was kind of answering big questions, but it was just very, very sensible in its analysis and in its analysis of human suffering.
Hmm.
And it made some very, very sensible suggestions, very pragmatic suggestions about what we can do when we're feeling miserable or confused or uptight in whatever way. So, to begin with, I think at the beginning, I was very interested in psychology and addressing it as a psychological text. And I think I primarily addressed it as a psychological text.
Hmm.
It's kind of, I mean, without sounding too cheesy, it was almost like a self-help book. It's a psychological self-help book in at one level, because it analyzes the way our minds kind of go out of balance and skew our perceptions, and it's a manual on what we can do about that and how we might be able to cultivate a clearer perception, both of ourselves and of others. Now, I think a bit like Hans. I was going to say Hansel and Gretel, but like crumbs on a mousetrap. Leading. You have the and I think it starts off, or the way we were taught it starts off at a very physical level, and then goes to a mental level, and then it keeps on going. And the Yoga Sutra, we're still, although it's only 195 short statements, it's an absolute treasure trove of wisdom, which we are still absolutely mining. And it doesn't require you to believe anything. It doesn't require you to believe in God or not to believe in God or to be a Hindu or anything like that. It actually gives some very, very coherent and sensible suggestions about why we suffer, how we suffer, what might be a route out of that suffering at various levels. So, at a kind of a very simple, pragmatic level of, how we can reduce our suffering from it being very, very overblown to being just copeable with, to then eradicating suffering completely.
Okay, so let's actually take in a little bit, dissect that. So, I think we're right now with COVID and the world spinning upside down. We're suffering. And so, what could the Yoga Sutras tell us about the nature of why we suffer, how we suffer, and what is the root of that suffering?
The Yoga Sutra, I mean, one of the things that big light bulb moments for me in studying the Yoga Sutra and then writing about it in this book was the idea of there's a word called klesha, klesha, okay, and klesha is sometimes translated as afflictions. Okay, and right at the beginning of the sutra, I think it's Sutra 5, it says that our minds, the way we think, we have loads of thoughts going on all the time. You know, maybe we're imagining something, or maybe we're remembering something, or maybe we're seeing something very clearly, or seeing something in a very confused way, whatever it was. But whatever things are going on in our minds can be either what Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutra, says can be either klishta or aklishta. And what he means by that is it can either lead to kind of suffering, and it can be afflictive, or it can lead us away from suffering. Klishta or
Away from,
klishta,
or
aklishta.
Klishta.
Yeah,
Okay.
aklishta. Yeah, and he says this really, really interesting thing is that from the most enlightened person in the world to an earthworm, every creature suffers from klesha. Okay, so every creature suffers from this from mental afflictions, if you like. And then he goes on to analyze how they manifest in a human being. And I think this links up very much with what's going on now with media and all this sort of thing. But basically, he says the root klesha, the root affliction, is a misunderstanding of our nature, of who we are. Okay, so we tend to think of ourselves as our fictional created selves. If you, I'm sure you know, I'm sure you know this, but you know, we are, of course, different with different people. You're going to be different with your mum, to your children, to your employer, to somebody at the shop, to somebody who you don't like. All those, you know, we play a whole bunch of roles. And Patanjali, 2,000 years ago, was suggesting that one of the roots of suffering is when we when we get glued to our mask. So we get completely identified with not just the role that we are playing, but also the thoughts that are going on in our head. If you spend a lot of time, which is quite difficult not to do, but being exposed to all the news that we are currently exposed to about COVID, about the general terrible things that are going on in the world, it has an influence on our minds, and we tend to get glued and self-identify with all that. And in doing so, that creates and stimulates both desires and aversions. These desires and aversions, not any desire or any aversion, because some desires can be helpful, some aversions can be helpful, but particular types of desire which maintain the fiction of who we are, and particular aversions which maintain the fiction of who we are, these can become habitual and addictive. And it just causes us, and it results in fear. Fear is the big one. Fear of loss is the klesha which kind of drives us, in my understanding of Patanjali's sutras. So we have this kind of misidentification of who we are, powered by obsessive desires and aversions, and in the shadows, driving all of that is fear. That's a potent concoction of toxic psychological states, which we're pretty much unconscious of, and which we carry around quite a lot. So Patanjali's message is, guys, let's just kind of reduce these until they get manageable. Not necessarily eradicate them, because he's not saying you can just kind of eradicate these things. They are very hardwired into us. But if we can reduce them to a manageable state, and then from a manageable state, we can then go further.
In the next segment, let's talk a little bit about how we can, some of the toxic psychological states that I've been hearing from different listeners. So we've been talking to Ranju Roy about his book, Embodying the Yoga Sutra. And in the next
And
segment,
Dave Charlton's book as well.
sorry, Dave
Dave,
Charlton and Ranju Roy's book that they
yeah.
co-authored. Sorry, Dave. So, we're in the next segment. We're going to be talking about toxic psychological states that perhaps we're in right now as a society, and how we can actually reduce them to a manageable state. So, thank you so much. Can you show the copy of your book too, and how people can reach you?
Sure. It's Embodying the Yoga Sutra, Support, Direction, and Space. And that people can reach us on our website, which is Sadhanamala Training.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. You're welcome.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.